I want to thank Dario Epstein and all his team for the invitation and for organizing this very important forum again. Obviously, I want to thank Spets for these words, for the prize. A prize that is more than oversized, regarding what would correspond to me. I thank you. The truth is that I did not expect such a prize. It is a prize that excites me a lot emotionally. Although many did not like it, our government makes a constant effort to explain to people where we are and where we are going. This effort is not capricious or random, but it has a concrete meaning. We want Argentinians to be the ones who can take advantage of the opportunities that the country presents them. Because our country has lost decades and decades experimenting with centralist models that only generated misery and stagnation. While the rest of the countries in the region stabilized their currencies and grew, we discovered how far our decline could reach. Seeing the best years for Latin America go through the window in more than a century. Those years were not free. They meant paralysis, businesses that did not work or never existed, and a loss of faith in the future. Something poisonous for the survival of any nation. That is why we insist so much on explaining what we are doing and what country we are going to. Because that is the way we find for those who want to hear and solve their lives based on this future that we are creating. In 2023, Argentina decided to change for the better once and for all, thanks to people full of failed recipes. Looking for a real change, it chose the first liberal libertarian government in the history of Argentina and humanity. I always clarify that this does not happen in normal conditions of pressure and temperature. I always laugh at myself when I talk about type 2 error. Type 1 error is when you do everything right and it goes wrong. Type 2 error is when you do everything wrong and it goes right. In reality, I did everything wrong to be in politics in terms of politics. That is why I am the first liberal libertarian president in history. And there is also a good sign. It means that the Argentines decided to change. We can make our best efforts, but what will determine what we get out of the world are the Argentines themselves. I am going to tell an anecdote before continuing with the speech. Days ago, I went to a program in Euro called Aftermarket with a person I appreciate a lot, a great professional, a great person. I met his Rabbi Caspinius, who is truly sensational. And he told me that he was going to give me a speech in which he was going to talk about his life. Caspinius is a really sensational speaker. And he has used a phrase of mine that says, if I am president, Argentina will be investment grade. And then he put the graph of how the qualification of Argentina is improving, and Julian, with a lot of generosity, said, well, we are on the way if we continue like this. We will achieve it. And that is the reality, I said it before, of the electric chair. And the reality, what I realized, is that the phrase was, despite that the achievement is seen, it is seen with clarity. I say that we go from the level of risk country of 3,000 to less than 500. That is, yesterday we broke the 500 point again. and that Argentina already has tax indicators to be worthy of having a much better qualification. I think he surprised Churion because I told him, but it had seemed to me that phrase from that moment on my part was a fatally arrogant phrase, because what is going to be that Argentina is investment grade. It is not that we have decided the right direction. Which is to embrace the idea of freedom again. It is not only the government, that is, Argentina is going to be investment grade the day that the Argentines decide to be investment grade, the day that the Argentines decide to embrace the idea of freedom, and the only thing that is going to be necessary is the driver who leads that, but only Argentina is going to be investment grade the day that the Argentines definitely decide to embrace the ideas of freedom and end up burying populism. If it is the unstable part, when I take out my glasses, you already know that it is the moment of danger. Then I turn my glasses back and it remains with the confidence of the Argentine people. And through a plan of unprecedented structural reforms, we are taking out the country of century of sustained decline. This is also important to say. Never in Argentine history was there such a big spread between what is happening in the economy and what the media say. This has never been seen in a life. It has never been seen in attacks or disproportionate. An unfaithful government to have orders of magnitude. We, since we arrived, taking the indicator of them, that is the monthly estimator of economic activity, basically in terms of destationing. Today, the indicator is 11% higher than when we received power. The last indicator gave 3.8% the destationing. He knows that the tip of the destationing is huge, and making theories about her specific data, even when it is very good, it would not be technically correct to embrace that number because it is very volatile at the tick of the destationing. And in comparison, every year, it is showing that the economy grew 5.5%. And if I look at the indicator that seems more relevant to us, which is the cycle trend, 3 months ago, the indicator showed 3 months in a row of an expansion of 0.4%. That is, Argentina has been expanding to a rhythm of 5% per year. There may be people who think it is little, who think it is a lot, but look, prior to our arrival, in the previous 100 years, the average growth rate in Argentina was 1% per year. That is, we are doubling the rate at which we are growing. So the reality is that the same with inflation. Is it the one we want? No, it is clearly not the one we want. But it came from a brutal acceleration. We were traveling every day. If we did not cut down on the tax imbalance, the imbalance of the central bank, and we would not put in order all the finances of the state, Without that, we would have ended up with a hyperinflation of around 15,000%. However, with effort of all Argentines and with the perishing of Minister Luis Torce Capito, his finance secretary, Pablo Cano, today Chancellor, and the President of the Central Bank, and his team, Santiago Basoli, we say they avoided a hyperinflation. That the economy expands, restore order in the streets, because prior to our arrival to power they were 9,000 pickets per year. Today they are zero, and we have the lowest crime index in history thanks to the work of Dr. Boric. But not only that, but we also ended up with what no one thought could be finished. And that is that we ended the managers of poverty. A very brave behavior of Minister Sandra Petrovillo, which I reminded you that at the beginning of the government, when we cut off these criminals by which they robbed the most vulnerable, they had subjected to an unmeasured media pressure to throw it away. However, they were held accountable, and today we can show that Argentina take 14 million people out of poverty. That in this framework, the fiscal balance, the deregulation and the economic opening have had a leading role in the Argentine resurgence after a century of crashing over and over again because of a centrally planned economy. I am talking about a resurgence based on the systematic correction of years and years of deprivation, where the nation was carried away by the derisive interventionism of the politicians on duty, which in addition to the counterfeit face of interventionism, actually asks, no, it is not a joke, that is people stealing from the Argentine people of good. Thanks to our measures, we have reached a macroeconomic order, cornerstone of any sustainable project. We have eradicated the fiscal deficit in our first month of government, something that everyone believed impossible, and we heal the passes of the central bank in the next 6 months, starting from an initial situation that was tragic. I say the best example, AIDS, right? And after healing the passes of the central bank and paying debt to the account for Jorge, thanks to the fiscal effort, we managed to heal the assets of the central bank and put an end to the monetary tragedy that we inherited, that is, the withdrawal of the debt that everyone said it would not be that in an electoral year. And I said, if we have the money, we are going to leave, and they said they will not do something like that in an electoral year, and I said, above the electoral, there is freedom. Freedom is not stained, and consequently, when we had the dollars, we went out and returned the freedom to the Argentines. And with this, inflation was also on a growing path. It had touched us. Minimum in May of 25, in 1.5, and after we won the election of the city there, began the attacks of politics. It must be said openly, they tried a coup of state. They tried it in the Chamber of Deputies and the Congress with 7 attempts. A political trial. They attacked the economic program with 40 laws, trying to violate the fiscal balance, even violating the own law that establishes that their laws, when they sanction expenses, they have to have a financing counterparty or lack of relationship, order of magnitude. I do not forget the stupidity of a person who said, no, you can pay the retirees by eliminating the president's trips. Please, those proportions, and in those attacks, what happened was a massive.
En esos ataques, lo que ocurrió fue una salida
Exit of Argentine assets. Exit of Argentine assets made the price of
salida de los activos argentinos hizo que el precio de los
themselves fall. That implies that the country's risk rose. They rose as the country's risk rose. The rate also rose in pieces because as the demand for money fell and the rate of inflation accelerated, the nominal rate jumped strongly, and that race came to represent 50% of MTOL, something I have never seen in Argentine history, that is $41 billion. And if we had not taken the precautionary measures that the gurus of the market told us, have everything to do with that. That is, those who always criticize us, they criticize us for that. Which was when we did the disarmament of the leftists and the aid engagers, those would have been 29,000 million more dollars. That is, the size of the attack was equivalent to $70,000 million. And they say no, but it was saved because the United States put 2,500. It is a problem of order of proportion. That is, we cannot put 70,000 against 2,500 on the same foot. That is, it is a problem of order of magnitude. That is a question of intellectual honesty. And obviously that fall in the demand for money had two effects, the rise in them. Interest rates generated a destruction of working capital in the economy, and the economy stopped dry. An economy that had been growing for the first quarter to 6, accelerating to 8, suddenly stopped, and that obviously generated a break in activity, and that situation played with the fact that inflation was accelerating due to the fall in the demand for money. I mean, it basically generates a drop in activity or deceleration of activity, fall in real salaries, or that they grew less than they have been growing, and obviously that situation generated a discontent where basically that worst discomfort was evident during the first quarter of this year, however, and despite all the meaty pressure, despite the false accusations, despite all that, we in a month and a half we fulfilled all our campaign promises for the midterm elections, because between the section that the Congress operated in extraordinary during December and February, I remind you that among other things, deficit zero came out. The law of imputability came out, which was something that had been discussed for 40 years. Labor modernization came out. Everyone knew that it had been more than 50 years that this had to be changed. Not only that, the agreement with the European Union was signed. In addition, a law of enormous importance was sanctioned, which is the law of tax innocence, where historically the Argentines in front of the tax office were guilty until they showed the opposite, and yet now we are innocent until the opposite is proven. That is, we are the first government that not only returns freedom to the Argentines by lowering 2.7 points from the tax GDP, we return freedom to the Argentines by restoring the rights to property by lowering and eliminating regulations, but we have also returned freedom with the presumption of innocence. While we are very liberal, And I don't know if I said it, but we also took out the law of glaciers. That was no longer extraordinary. And the other day, for example, the supposed government that has no initiative and that does not move, and that is paralyzed, in addition to taking out laws that no one had ever been able to take out. The other day in the Chamber of Deputies, we won 13-0 in the votes that they were, well, what are we doing? And among other things, this fact of having lowered inflation so much.
Entre otras cosas, este hecho de haber bajado tan fuerte la inflación
has returned to the Argentines the possibility of planning their lives, and this is fundamental. Because that predictability is necessary for a family planning as well as fundamental for the management of new investments. There is a phrase by Friedrich von Hayek that is wonderful, says the more the state plans, the less the individual plans. And in addition, it disorders him all his life. That is, it returns him to the extreme that communism has. That is, it was a failure in the economic, the social, the cultural, I say, and they kill 150 million human beings. Well, I say that is what happens when we say the one who plans is the state now. When the state runs, the private sector plans its life and prospers, and in that sense, inflation. For example, one of the things it does is hinder the economic calculation and put noise in the price system and destroy long-term growth. What you have to understand that eliminating inflation is a necessary condition to grow. It is not a sufficient condition. That is, we need it basically to remove the noise about the price system and for the allocation of resources to be the correct one, but basically that is not what generates growth. Eliminating inflation is not what generates growth. That is, the monetary stability and the macroeconomic order in general. Although they are essential, they are not the engine of growth. Because we also inherited a state that was not disordered only in its accounts, but also in this legislation. In fact, having adjusted 15 points of the GDP was to increase the savings, return that to the private sector, and that finances economic growth. That said, the credit is growing strongly again. Therefore, every week that passes, we can have a little basic in the indicators, but the trend is clear. Argentina is going to a scenario of lower inflation and greater growth. That is why the next qualitative leap, once the numbers are ordered, is the release of growing yields through deregulation. When the state stops being a brake, company scale, productivity rises, and growth accelerates. That is what we implement with the RIGI, what we are going to deepen with the super RIGI, and what we have just sent to Congress. The issue of growing yields sounds like a technical issue. I understand that it is a technical issue. It has to do with something that in economic growth is called a hockey stick. And it has to do with the evolution of the GDP per capita from the Yes era in the Christian era to the present. And what you have is that throughout those first 1800 years in the Christian era, the GDP per capita only rose 40% after the discovery of America. That is to say that the economy grew at a rate of 0.2% per capita. That is, we needed 3,500 years to double the GDP per capita, but that changed radically after the Industrial Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution. The population of the world multiplied by 10 and the GDP per capita by 15. That is, we had a revolution of productivity and well-being as never seen in The history of humanity, that of having the health that the product has risen more than proportionally to the population, those 15 times, those are called growing years. And it was what Adam Smith called the pin factory and explained that the division of work made it possible to produce more. Well, the division of work, for example, depends on the size of the market. So how can we expand the size of the market? Open the economy. I got an agreement with the European Union. I got an agreement with the United States. I got an agreement with EFTA. We're going to continue opening the Argentine economy. And on the other hand, regulation is almost as violent as taxes. Because it is true, the tax is direct aggression, it is direct robbery. But regulation too, because let's suppose that I have as a business to rent offices in a building. And then a primate comes with, the primates and makes a rent law. Okay, they destroyed the business, their business, or after that it is worth much less. Notice that we took out the rent law, the properties in the rent were duplicated. And the price in real terms fell by 30%. In the end, who were the ones who were on the side of the vulnerable? The liberals. As for the Super RIGI, it aims to deepen the conquest of the RIGI. Specifically encouraging investment in areas that do not exist in the country today. The logic is very simple. It is much more beneficial to collect less from something than to collect much from nothing. So imposing a high tax burden on something that does not exist does not bring a benefit for anyone, while lowering the tax burden can generate that something exists in the first place and benefits us all in the process. It is interesting to see fragment that is circulating on the networks of the governor of Niquain, Role Figueroa, who says, entering the RIGI cost me $3.5 million in resources and is bringing investments in the province by $1,000 million. Well, that's why Niquain is today in the province that grows the most in Argentina at 12% per annum. That is why this new regime has its own entry threshold. Investments of at least $1,000 million with a commitment to invest at least 20% of the amount within the first 2 years from the start date. Then it also brings benefits of second order, given that existing the fiscal conditions of the RIGI, of the Super RIGI, we will see that the rest of the economy will converge to its values until we have a single national condition. This is also important. Our idea of the fiscal is not that the things that are in the RIGI are similar to the fiscal that we have today. The idea is that the fiscal converges towards the former of the RIGI and the Super RIGI, that is, going to a system with much less fiscal pressure. And although different sides of the opposition have spent the last years saying that we had a lot of theory but little practice, we can already see the results of our actions. Milton Friedman would say, guys, first the data. I also saw a cut from a truly sinister journalist a few days ago, because he also has an economist title, and he said, my law lied to the Argentinians when he said that we were going to come out as abuse, let's say in B, or we came out stronger than in B, if we compare against what
Si comparamos contra lo que
The fall
fue
was, we finished processing the fall that the Cucas left us, which in fact,
que, digamos, terminamos de procesar la caída que nos dejaron los K. Que dicho sea
this
de paso, la
statistical
gráfica
drag was
estadística
like a fall of
una caída de
3.5, and from the month of April 2024, the economy
el mes de abril del 2024 la economía
grows very
crece muy
strongly.
fuertemente.
I mean, but hey, what can we expect from that serial liar if he is
Pero
there?
bueno, ¿qué podemos esperar de ese mentiroso serial si es el
Sane
mismo
journalist, if you can say so, who said, he anticipated 40 times that my minister of
anticipó 40 veces que eché a mi ministro de
economy had a symbiotic relationship with him? In fact, that lie came to say, I tell you, because they are questions of protocol, part of the committee as an ambulance. He saw the ambulance and said that we had been caught up and that one came out in an ambulance. I say, more science fiction impossible. That is, I understand that science fiction writers who make fiction in journalism, I can understand it, but I say that an economist that says that amount of nonsense is trilly, but hey, the lack of guidelines is not free.
Pero bueno, la falta de pauta no es gratis.
The other thing to mention is that this also brings second-order benefits, what I just pointed out, so I'm going to return to the speech. As a consequence of these measures, Argentina is one of the countries that has grown the most in Latin America in 2025. According to estimates from different organizations, we are the country that will grow the most in the coming years, taking into account that we have come to avoid the worst crisis in our history and considering that Argentina did not grow between 2011 and 2023, it is clear that the idea of freedom works, and also when we put in comparison with other administrations that had to rebank the initial adjustment, the best compared output is that of the libertarian liberal government. And if this idea is about, and theory is about, today I want to bring them into exercise so that you can understand what we think for the future, because obviously we plan to continue making reforms. We see that the state behaves like an insurance provider. In the last instance, to old age in the case of retirement, illness in the case of public health, to financial stability in the case of the central bank. But what is the problem? That being, an inefficient and excessively large lender, when you need it, it fails. This was demonstrated with brutal clarity in the pandemic, in which if we had behaved like a mediocre country, we would have had 30,000 deaths, and yet we had 130,000. That is, the inefficiency of the state cost the lives of 100,000 Argentines. And this has to do with what we are. Thinking about of how to move forward in the agenda of freedom, the aspiration to see the state as an insurance provider is inspired basically in a debate between John Rawls and Robert Nozick, and how this issue was faced by Haig. The reality is that people have aversion to risk. That is, if you put a person in front of having to choose two situations, one of which can be extremely rich and the other being extremely poor, I say is likely that an intermediate solution is more satisfactory than going to the side. That is, people have aversion to risk. That is a fact. In fact, it is with what the left systematically plays and the populists play. If you look at it during the campaign of 23, they did what they called the fear campaign. For example, they said that organ sales were going to be allowed. I say, someone could trade the organ here. They said they were going to close the public university. Those who know are there. They said they were going to close the hospitals. The hospitals are still there. That is, it is a strategy of the left to scare people. That is, they resort to fear. This is now. Minor, because when he studied the great epidemics in the history of humanity, one of the things that caused the most deaths was fear. 20% of people died of fear. And if you want a monstrous experiment about it, it was a pandemic. I say that it had the complicity of politicians and media. It was the moment of the paroxysm of journalism, lying and deceiving people, scaring, frightening. Then they complain. From that, the emergence of social networks was strongly seen in today. They are pouring through the bill and they are not backing up. But the interesting thing is this of the concept of thinking of the state and politics as a matter of insurance. I mentioned some emblematic cases, but we can also think of them in cases of international policy. For example, international trade. You've seen how they have criticized Trump with different measures or the criticism of European countries for protecting the agricultural sector. It is a classic. Now, to understand the matters of trade, there is a standard model, which is the model with which economists work. It is called the Hirsch-Osland model. The Hirsch-Osland model, which is a general balance model of two agents, which could be two countries, two goods. Well, that model is all microfunded. Part of four models, which is the comparative advantage of Ricardo, the Stolper-Samuelson, the factor price equalization, and RIGI. With those, they derive that model. To understand that model, you have to know a lot about microeconomics, and there is no one who has better microeconomists than the French. The question is, what happens? Why do the French do this if they are the ones who know the most? It is that politics is more complex, because if you let the Hirsch-Osland go, the French would not produce food. But what happens if there was an event of risk that could leave them without food? Well, they would have to go to an insurance market. Well, if that risk is a war, they cannot be covered suddenly by wars that last many years. What is natural insurance? Comes precisely when the war comes. Insurance is not fulfilled. When sinister appears, it is not fulfilled. So how do the French know that if there is a war, they will not suffer hunger? They have an agricultural sector. Clearly, it is inefficient. Obviously, it is inefficient, but that is the price. That is the price they pay in case of an event of a war, so that people do not die of hunger. It is so brittle, and you know what? The two world wars that they were began with the Germans attacking France. So if they have a risk aversion, they have some reasons for it. So the same happens if you want to look at the logic of Trump. What is the point of Trump? Well, look, you can leave everything free if Hirsch-Osland and that suddenly all the production of uranium and all the nuclear production is in the hands of an opposing military power. How do you think it will end? It will end up flying through the air, and then it will say, no, but Hirsch-Osland said. There is time to correct the error of three nerds looking at a model of precarious analysts who do not know how to understand geopolitical risks. So you have to understand that the world has changed, that political risks matter, and that also generates a great advantage for those who can produce energy, fluid, minerals, and an economy of knowledge. Everything we have.
Minerales y economía del conocimiento. Todo lo que tenemos nosotros.
If we did not get on the train, we are going to have the last chance. In this sense, this vision of looking at the state, for example, as insurance and others, if we develop a private insurance market that is competitive, deep and complete, the justification for the state to intervene in those areas disappears by itself. That is to say, if you want, given that individuals have aversion to risk and the state gives them the insurance, if you want to shrink the state, you need to generate the insurance that allows you to substitute the action of the state for the insurance market. What is it called when you have a health insurance prepayment? They are not happy with the care they have. Well, they have private security. They do not like public education. They go to a private school. Well, it is because they are not so satisfied with the repair in the face of the need. That is what they appear. So, as she grow and develop the insurance market, the need to have a state decreases, and consequently that allows us to continue lowering taxes. And this is fundamental. What we call the insurance revolution that we are going to present with Dr. Sturzenegger. What RIGI want to make a clarification, and is that this obviously contemplates is also an orderly transition to the new system. In other words, it is not that we are going to make these changes, since the markets are not complete and they are not deep. These transitions cannot be made instantly. They are made so that they are ordered and configured until they can reach the ideal. That is what I want you to know. I say that it will take time. It is not something that starts now, it starts to work. But that takes time, it is not instantaneous. Because sometimes people pretend, I say that things are done instantly, and so it may be that the remedy is worse than the disease. And why do I highlight all this? Because we have to be clear where we are standing to be able to choose where we want to go. The world is changing at an accelerated rate, perhaps as never before, driven by new technologies whose potential we have barely discovered. Phenomena such as artificial intelligence hide secrets that could imply a qualitative leap in human development, such as the Industrial Revolution at the moment. From my point of view, it is basically the equivalent of the pin factory, artificial intelligence. Factory is the pin factory of the 21st century. But history continues today in new world order is being configured in the way in which we insert ourselves, and it will determine the fate of our country. We can be in favor of freedom or make common cause with dictatorships and tyrannies, as in the darkest moments of our nation and our continent. Argentina has its priorities very clearly and has re-established its foreign policy after a return to its Western roots and Christian Jews. We believe that the era of global cooperation without moral compass has ended. We have entered a new era of great nations that compete to ensure vertical value chains. And as time goes by, the division of the world between free nations and underprivileged nations will only deepen. In this panorama, neutrality ceases to be an option. Well, it was clear that this required someone who was not warm. And I think we have taken a clear international position. Well, all our positions are very clear, but the international one is probably the one that is most openly seen. And precisely these times of change require correct diagnosis, a well-calibrated moral compass, and the courage to act. the lack of clear moral alignments culminates in alliances with tyrannies, and the lack of perishing necessarily derives from the misuse of historical opportunities. The Argentines have already suffered embracing socialism instead of taking advantage of the favorable international context to achieve sustained growth in freedom. This cannot happen again. And this new great alliance, in science, since we are only in the birth of a new era, will imply a recomposition of the value chains based on these principles. Commerce will accompany not only the momentary sales, which are necessary if we have to build them with policies such as the RIGI and the super RIGI, but also the values of the fine peoples, because that is the only certainty of long-term coincidence. But against the fear of many, this will not imply that Argentina participate in this new concert of nations as a subordinate and relevant act or reduced exclusively to the export of raw wood. Although we do not doubt the importance of the primary sector, the profound changes that we are experiencing also encourage the creation of a huge variety of industries in the country, incentives that we are convinced that the Argentines can take advantage of. The main driver of this new Argentine industrialization will be cheap energy, a product of the development of our energy sector. With energy, a reduction in the cost of the state, the development of human capital, deregulation and commercial opening, Argentina is becoming a pole of attraction of global tax industrial inversions. Argentine talent will have the opportunity for the first time in decades to shine at the level that it deserves, without the need to migrate as in the past. It will not be easier to migrate than to shine. We will be able to shine on our own land. For all this, today we have what the West needs. We have energy from oil, gas, and even nuclear energy, also minerals, fertilizers for cultivation, and we are strategically located so that all these products, as well as the industrial ones, do not pose a greater risk of interruption in the face of threat. Kirchnerism will turn our country, and especially the private sector, into a great desert, in which only what was under the shadow of political power grew. Now we see that desert flourishing with thousands of new industries. We will see a miracle of the period and geographies in which freedom is allowed to act under fair and clear rules. We will see the refinement of uranium flourishing, the processing of cellulose, the production of fertilizers, the forestry industry, the agricultural and cattle production, and, from now on, the oil and gas industries. But the beauty of this list is that it is not a closed list. We are not choosing winners and losers, but we are generating the conditions for those who know how to create, develop, and grow to be able to do it. We are giving Argentinians the freedom to create their own future. A government does not need to dictate the terms of tomorrow because we have faith that the Argentines will be the ones who build them. We are allowing the Argentines to be the architects of their own future, without being disturbed by the state. And as if all this were not enough, today the American continent is the refuge of freedom. The world is wrapped in conflict, geopolitical tensions, instability, and governments unable to recognize the severe challenges to the status quo that is the origin of all this. Argentina and the entire region must preserve the peace that they have enjoyed for a long time, to the point of giving it for nothing. The United States understands the importance of a peaceful continent, advocated for growth and human flourishing, and not to socialist and communist political adventures that lead to servitude and misery. That is today the core of the new mono doctrine by President Trump, who prays America for the Americans. This means nothing more and nothing less than America must be a continent in which all its inhabitants can freely exercise their faculties, grow economically, and prosper without foreign powers interfering with that growth to favor their own interests. Here he applies the same principle of the insurance that I explained earlier. What the United States is looking for within the assurance is exactly that, to have a safe geopolitical, it wants its chains of value close with reliable partners so as not to be exposed if the world is fragmented even more. Latin America may be that refuge, but to be eligible, we have to be at the top. That is why today countries that had fallen in the worst of tyranny are being liberated, such as Venezuela, and we will soon see Cuba free. The world cannot tolerate such injustices that spread throughout the region, but they gave the attempts of local dictators a model to imitate. Argentina has everything necessary to lead this process of transformation. In Latin America, we must remember our regional leadership as the true lighthouse of the South, that we were known to be throughout our history. We must be the example to follow for the whole nation, with the will to twist its destiny and to head again towards the path of freedom. Who takes the first step towards the future may find himself only at the beginning, but he also opened a new path, and quickly arises those who seek to imitate his example. I say there is no need for me to tell you the story of Naxon and the Red Sea. It was the first thing that began to happen, and that when the water reached here and decided to continue advancing, the waters opened, the Red Sea crossed, and the Jewish people left behind the slavery of Egypt. Then, and fulfilling this function is fundamental, because today Latin America grows way below in its potential. The fiscal and regulatory fixation that decades of left and center-left government have generated in the region, despite the fact that it prospers, the speed there should not be. That is much less. All this limits on investment, incorporation in global value chains, and leaves on the table an opportunity that others are going to capture before us if we neglect. This is something that our government has more than clear. See if it was not efficient. The action of Chancellor Pablo Kirchner with trade with the European Union. I say, in the end, the joy was not Brazilian, it was Argentine. Let's hope that the joy returns to Argentina in a few months. Come on, Messi, damn it. It is not enough for us to grow more than the last 20 or 25 years. Our own bar is not so low, but we know that we must grow at a more vigorous pace, even so as not to fall behind, because we started from the subsurface. For all this, we believe that we are facing a unique opportunity for Latin America, but especially for Argentina. The reconfiguration of global trade, the search for reliable allies, the need for new partners, the need for new value chains and energy shortage, all this converges now. If we are serious, if we lower the regulatory and fiscal burden, if we position ourselves as a great stable bloc of the world, we will be able to capture industries and investments as never before in our history, and dramatically accelerate a process of growth that is already started, because this is a new world for the new world. And if we do not move with the current, if again by imperfection or evil we are left out of the train of growth, we will be humiliated as we have been in this long 20th century that passed. For it to be clear, a nation that does not grow is transiting the path to its humiliation and its disappearance. So it is a national duty to fight with all our forces the ghost of the delay represented by socialist and statist policies. For all that has been exposed, we firmly believe that Argentina has already made its decision to stop seeing history pass in front of its eyes, seeing how others take advantage of the opportunities while its leaders continue to try to find the square of the circle, insisting on irresponsible formulas for success or failures. The train passes only once, and Argentina has already bought its ticket. The question is whether the region is willing or not to follow it. May God bless the Argentines, may the force of heaven accompany us, and long life freedom. Thank you very much to all.